Bro, what are you watching? Oh, dude, I'm just watching a show about people that got killed, tortured, murdered, abused, beaten, mutilated. A pause. Uh, why? And honestly, I don't even know, man. It's just so calming and peaceful. And yeah, when you say it out loud like that, it sounds pretty concerning. Whether you feel like you belong on some kind of list, or you're just dealing with a morbid curiosity about how these twisted minds actually work, this video is probably for you. There's something strange about how true crime pulls people in, not because it's entertaining, but because it's unsettling in a quiet, almost hypnotic way. You're not watching explosions or jump scares. You're watching normal-looking people, living normal-looking lives, hiding things that shouldn't exist. And that's the part that sticks with you. The part that makes you keep watching, even when you know you probably shouldn't. This isn't about glorifying violence or turning killers into legends. It's about looking straight at the uncomfortable truth that some of the most terrifying things on this planet don't look terrifying at all. This isn't about numbers. Before we go any further, there's one thing I need to make very clear. This list is not based on kill count alone. Bigger numbers don't automatically mean someone is scarier. If that were the case, this video would just be a leaderboard. And honestly, these people don't deserve that kind of ranking. What makes someone truly disturbing goes much deeper than statistics. The fear factor here comes from their overall vibe, their story, the way they moved through the world, and the methods they used without raising suspicion. Some of these people blended in so well that no one questioned them for years. They were trusted, respected, even loved by the people around them. That's what makes this unsettling. This video isn't about who killed the most people. It's about who felt the most wrong once you really understand them. There's no particular order here, no countdown, no worst of the worst. Just a series of individuals whose existence should never make sense, but somehow does. And with that in mind, let's begin. Ted Bundy, the wolf in sheep's clothing. Starting off strong, we have Ted Bundy. And for a lot of people, this is where the fear really begins. Ted Bundy wasn't scary because he looked like a monster. He was scary because he didn't. He was well-educated, articulate, charismatic, and charming in a way that made people feel safe around him. He was the kind of guy you'd trust to help you carry groceries or fix a broken car, and that's exactly how he got close to his victims. For me personally, that's what makes him a nightmare. He was a textbook example of a wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding something deeply twisted behind a perfectly normal face. What makes it even worse is how openly he moved through society without raising alarms. On top of that, Ted Bundy was a master of escape. He literally escaped police custody twice, and after the second escape, he went on to commit 6 more murders, which is absolutely insane when you really think about it. There's also a strange irony in his story. Ted actually attended law school for a year, which feels almost unreal given everything he would go on to do. Once he was finally caught, the full scope of his crimes began to surface. He eventually admitted to over 30 murders involving abduction, assault, and the killing of young women. During his trial, he partially represented himself, clearly enjoying the spotlight, and in one of the most disturbing moments, he even proposed to his girlfriend during sentencing. Ted Bundy didn't just kill people. He fed off attention, control, and the illusion of power. And that combination is exactly what makes him so terrifying. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death. Next up, we have Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, and this one hits differently. Harold wasn't a drifter, a criminal, or someone living on the edges of society. He was a family doctor in the small town of Hyde in the United Kingdom. He was trusted, respected, and deeply embedded in his community. Most of his patients were elderly, people who relied on him completely and rarely questioned his decisions. At first glance, nothing about him felt threatening, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Looking back at his early life, Shipman was the primary caretaker for his mother while she was dying of cancer, an experience that pushed him toward medical practice. He became a doctor, started a family, and built what appeared to be a successful career. There was a period where he developed a drug addiction that nearly cost him everything. He was fined on multiple drug charges, sent to rehab, and eventually declared cured, allowing him to practice medicine again. And that's when things truly took a dark turn. Under his care, elderly patients, especially women, began to die at alarming rates. Shipman would find any excuse to use a hypodermic needle, delivering lethal doses of morphine that caused fatal overdoses. The horrifying irony is that this was the same drug used to ease his mother's pain years earlier. Like Ted Bundy, Shipman was terrifying because of how unassuming he was. A family man, a respected doctor, someone you'd trust with your life. Many early deaths were written off as natural causes due to age, which allowed him to continue unchecked. He was finally exposed after altering a patient's will to leave everything to him. That single greedy mistake led to a full investigation, revealing that Harold Shipman was responsible for over 215 deaths, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov 3rd. On this list is Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Rostov Ripper, and his story is deeply tied to where he lived. Chikatilo was a serial killer operating in Soviet Russia, and that context matters more than you might think. At the time, the state-controlled media refused to acknowledge the existence of serial killers. Authorities believed crimes like this were a Western problem, not something that could happen under their system. That denial gave Chikatilo years of freedom. On the surface, he was completely unremarkable, an unassuming traveling businessman who blended into everyday life without drawing attention. But beneath that exterior were urges far darker than most people can imagine. Chikatilo was what's known as a sadistic necrophile, someone who derived pleasure from pain, violence, and death. He targeted runaways, sex workers, and homeless individuals, people society often labeled as disposable or less dead. As bodies began to pile up, the brutality of the crimes became impossible to ignore. The public started whispering about monsters and even a werewolf because the condition of the bodies was so horrific. Police investigations went in all the wrong directions, focusing on satanic cults and recently released psychiatric patients, never considering that the killer could be a normal-looking man hiding in plain sight. It wasn't until a psychiatrist was brought in that progress was finally made, suggesting the killer might be someone ordinary, someone who could be standing next to you without raising suspicion. In a chilling moment, Chikatilo was once caught at a bus stop, talking to a potential victim, carrying Vaseline, rope, and a knife in his briefcase. Even then, he slipped through because his blood didn't initially match the evidence. Years later, when police brought him in again with little time and little proof, it only took a 2-hour conversation with a psychiatrist for Chikatilo to break and confess to everything. He was responsible for the brutal deaths of 56 young men and women and was ultimately sentenced to death, executed by a bullet to the back of the head. Let's take a breath. All right, things have gotten pretty dark, so before we keep going, let's slow it down for just a second. Take a breath. Stories like these have a way of creeping into your head, not because they're loud or dramatic, but because they're quietly disturbing. It's crazy to think about how twisted these individuals were, and even crazier to realize how normal they seemed on the surface. They weren't hiding in shadows or living on the outskirts of society. They had jobs, families, routines. They existed right alongside everyone else. That's the part that really messes with you if you think about it long enough. And just to be clear, this list isn't in any particular order. None of these people deserve to be ranked or compared like stats on a scoreboard. Every story here stands on its own, and every one of them is disturbing in a different way. So if you're still with me, buckle up, because we're jumping right back in, and from here on out, it only gets heavier. Jeffrey Dahmer, Obsession and Control. Next up, we're back in the United States with one of the most infamous and well-documented serial killers of all time, Jeffrey Dahmer. Even if you only know the basics of his story, it's not hard to understand why he's on this list. From a very young age, Dahmer experienced intense, violent thoughts, and it didn't take long for those thoughts to turn into actions. Between 1978 and his arrest in 1991, he murdered 17 people in ways that were uniquely horrific and deeply disturbing. Dahmer would drug his victims, assault them, murder them, and in many cases continue to abuse their bodies afterward. He dismembered them, kept body parts as souvenirs, and even consumed parts of their remains. According to Dahmer himself, keeping pieces of his victims made him feel closer to them, as if they could never truly leave him. What makes his mindset especially unsettling is that he claimed he didn't want to kill anyone. In his mind, murder was simply the only way to achieve what he truly wanted: complete control and permanent companionship. He spoke openly about wanting a human slave, someone who had no free will, no desires, and no ability to leave. That level of obsession is hard to comprehend. Because Wisconsin did not have the death penalty at the time, Dahmer was sentenced to 973 years in prison. He never served most of that sentence, though, as he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. Even in death, his story remains one of the clearest examples of how loneliness, obsession, and unchecked darkness can merge into something truly monstrous. Armin Meiwes, the monster next door. Following the disturbing pattern of cannibals on this list, we move to Germany with Armin Meiwes, a case that feels almost unreal the deeper you go. Meiwes had an IQ of around 76, just above the threshold of being considered mentally challenged, but that never stopped him from operating unnoticed for years. He didn't stalk crowded cities or dramatic locations. The bodies were usually discovered days later, never immediately linked back to him. One of the most tragic parts of this case is how many innocent people suffered because of it. Friends, family members, and acquaintances of victims were frequently treated as suspects, and some completely innocent people took their own lives under the pressure, shame, and suspicion. What makes this even more disturbing is how Meiwes was perceived by those around him. In his own apartment building, he was known as a friendly figure, even nicknamed Uncle Armin by local children. He gave them treats and let them play with toys in his apartment, using that trust as a way to lure them. He was finally caught after murdering a neighborhood child and attempting to dispose of the remains by flushing them down a shared toilet. When a neighbor ignored his warning about a clogged bathroom and saw what was inside, police were called immediately. Officers forced their way into Meiwes' apartment and found him calmly cooking a stew. He quickly confessed, and investigators realized the horrifying truth. The meal contained human remains from the very victim they were searching for. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. Moving over to South America, specifically Colombia, we come to Pedro Lopez, a name that should honestly terrify more people than it does. Lopez became known as the monster of the Andes, and once you hear his story, it's easy to understand why. He was found guilty of murdering 110 young girls in Ecuador alone, and during questioning, he calmly confessed to killing an additional 240 girls across Peru and Colombia. That's over 300 victims by his own admission, a number so high it barely feels real. Naturally, you'd assume someone responsible for crimes on that scale would be sentenced to death or locked away for life. But that's where this story takes one of the most frustrating and disturbing turns on this entire list. Pedro Lopez was not executed. He was not sentenced to life in prison. Instead, he was released in 1998 on good behavior. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who admitted to murdering hundreds of children was set free. Even worse, his current whereabouts are completely unknown. Authorities lost track of him, and no one can say for certain where he is or if he's even still alive. And that's the part that makes this case especially unsettling in the present day. Lopez was born in 1948, which means that if he's still alive today, he would only be in his mid-70s. In other words, he could easily be just another elderly man walking down the side of the road, unnoticed, unrecognized, carrying one of the darkest histories imaginable. This case isn't just horrifying because of what he did, but because of how completely the system failed afterward. The idea that someone like this could disappear back into the world is genuinely hard to comprehend. John Wayne Gacy, the clown behind the mask. This next entry brings us back to the United States for the third and final time, with one of the most disturbing figures on this list, John Wayne Gacy. If you've heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, chances are you've also heard of Gacy. He was a businessman, a local politician, and a well-liked member of his community. On the surface, he appeared successful, friendly, and trustworthy, the kind of person people respected without question. Like many others on this list, he lived a double life. Gacy had a wife, a child, and a growing construction business, but behind closed doors, he was assaulting young men who were too afraid to speak out. When accusations eventually surfaced, Gacy was charged and imprisoned, but in a move that now feels unbelievable, he was later released on good behavior. That release gave him the opportunity to start over. He found a new wife, rebuilt his career, and regained the trust of those around him. But it wasn't long before he returned to his darkest impulses. Gacy developed an alter ego known as Pogo the Clown, a persona he used to perform at birthday parties, community events, and even hospitals. While appearing as a cheerful entertainer, he was feeding the same urges he tried to hide. At night, sometimes still dressed as a clown, Gacy would cruise the streets, forcing young boys into his vehicle at gunpoint. He assaulted and murdered them, then buried their bodies beneath his own home. Eventually, his basement became so full that he had no room left, and his final victim was dumped in a nearby river. When that body was discovered, police followed the trail straight back to him. A search of his home revealed the truth hidden beneath the floors. Even then, Gacy denied everything, claiming the bodies were planted as part of a political conspiracy against him. His refusal to accept responsibility only added another layer to an already horrifying story. The end of the list. And with that, we reach the end of this list of some of the scariest serial killers from around the world. These stories aren't easy to sit with, and honestly, they're not meant to be. None of these individuals deserve admiration, fame, or ranking, and that's why this list was never about numbers or competition. It was about understanding how danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a suit, sometimes a lab coat, sometimes a smile, and sometimes even a clown costume. This was only my 5th video, but without question, it was the hardest one I've ever had to research. Digging into these cases was brutal, and I intentionally kept things as tame as possible, because the full details are far darker than what was shared here. If you're looking for deep, explicit breakdowns, there are plenty of other videos out there that go into every disturbing detail. What I wanted to create was a simplified overview, a way to look at different killers from around the world without losing sight of the bigger picture. This video didn't have many jokes for obvious reasons, but the next one should be a bit lighter. And if you made it this far, you'd probably also be interested in the video on historical torture methods that's on screen right now. Feel free to check it out. That's all for this one. I'll see you next time. Trust me, bro.